Hi, this is Arun Bharti, and welcome to another episode of TFR Insights. And today we have with us Matt Jarvis, Senior Director of Community and Evangelism at D2iQ. Matt, first of all, welcome to the show.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
If I'm not wrong, D2iQ recently announced that you are contributing KUDO to CNCF. I want to talk about the announcement, but before that, what I do want to know is what does KUDO do? What problem you saw in the space that you wanted to solve that you created this piece of technology?
KUDO is a toolkit for developing Kubernetes operators that basically makes it a lot easier to develop these things. Many of the other ways of writing operators involve both a pretty deep understanding of the internals of Kubernetes, along with writing a lot of Go code. And that's as well as having to have the domain-specific knowledge of how to manage that particular application. So really, KUDO is aimed at simplifying that process, quite often being able to write a Kubernetes operator without writing any Go code whatsoever.
If I'm not wrong, there are already so many operators for Kubernetes or Kubernetes users. What unique value does KUDO bring to the ecosystem?
So it's really about that simplification. Piece for the development process. So lots of folks who want to develop operators for complex applications might be very familiar with the application that they want to operate, but not so familiar with how to write operators in the Kubernetes model. So KUDO is really very tightly targeted at simplifying that process, democratizing it so that more people have access to being able to write operators for their applications.
The main question, why you decided to put KUDO into CNCF? What was the reason?
We very strongly believe that the best place to grow the community around KUDO is inside the CNCF, and that's really because that's the home of vendor-neutral software in the cloud-native space. The operator ecosystem is becoming increasingly important for the next phase of container orchestration. And so having vendor neutral options available to the end user community is really going to be the key to adoption. The space is also moving very quickly, and we really want the widest possible user base to feed into the next phase of KUDO development as that space matures.
I will talk about the evolution of KUDO and CNCF, but you mentioned the next phase of Kubernetes container itself. How would you define that phase? What is going on? Because Kubernetes, it was evolution. Now companies are running in production. Now, almost everybody's running it, containerizing their application. So talk about the next phase. What does it look like?
For me, I think there's two things that are going on in the Kubernetes space that are becoming increasingly important. One is the ability to run more complex applications, particularly stateful distributed applications, which historically was always a difficult thing to be able to do on Kubernetes because of the way Kubernetes works. And so the operator space is really about enabling those more complex distributed applications to be able to run on Kubernetes. I think with an even a higher level view, I suspect that the next place that we're going to see focus on in the cloud native community is the developer experience. Kubernetes originally came from a place where it was supposed to be about very straightforward deployment of applications. And I think when you see huge adoption of a particular technology, it does tend to mean that it has to, by the nature of that adoption, become generalized. And so you get lots and lots of features, lots and lots of things kind of get shoehorned into that platform. And really, I think for application developers, should they have to understand all of that stuff? So I think we're going to start to see more PaaS type platforms being built on top of Kubernetes. So I really expect to see a much more of a focus on that developer experience.
In today's world, how important is open source still? Because we are seeing a lot of companies are trying different models of open source, different licenses of open source, different foundations of open source. And then you are putting your own code base into a neutral foundation. What do you see? Where is open source heading?
I mean, I think that's a very big question. I mean, clearly you're kind of preaching to the converted here as someone who spent their entire career working in open source software, right? And certainly you're absolutely correct that over the last, particularly over the last decade, I think we've seen a lot of challenges to the model of what open source is and what open source should be. I mean, I think it's definitely been proven many times over now that the open source development model produces the highest quality software. That is clearly at the heart of why open source has ended up being the dominant model in software development. In terms of where open source is going, there are a lot of challenges at the minute. There's challenges on how to, how does a company make money out of open source? There's only a very small number of companies who've really been successful long term in terms of monetizing that. But I think we've seen the concepts and ideas of how we do software development being taken into much wider spaces, right? We have companies releasing their own code as open source, the kind of inner source movement where people want to use the practicalities of how we develop software as a mechanism for creating higher quality software within their own organizations. So I think that the value proposition in terms of the software development model is very much proven. As you rightly point out, I think there's probably still open questions on the best ways for companies to survive with a very pure open source model. I can't say I have the answers to that, but I think when we look at the overall health of open source software in general, we're in a fantastic place, right? The entire world runs on open source software. I would definitely like to see, more thought, amongst open source communities about sustainability and how we make sure that we're engaging the developers of the future in open source. Very many of us have been around in this movement for quite a long time. So I think those are the interesting questions that we need to consider.
When you put something like KUDO in CNCF or any other foundation, number one is you kind of lose control over your own project. You cannot move with the same speed that you could have moved as an internal project. You have to deal with technical committee and all the stakeholders there. At the same time, you do cut almost all of your budget in R&D and the investment that you're putting into that project because your own competitors are actually helping improve the code base that you're leveraging. What do you get in return?
I think when we exist in open source spaces, right, and every vendor within the cloud native ecosystem exists in an open source space. Without open source software, none of us would actually be able to operate, right? Because the foundations of our industry are built on open source software. So in terms of what's important for us as a company is to contribute to the overall health of that ecosystem. Clearly there are ways for any company to monetize their particular expertise in a project, and that could be in support and services. Certainly we have product offerings around KUDO, particularly around the operator ecosystem that we're starting to build there. We have operators for things like Kafka, for Cassandra, for Spark, and we'll continue to invest in building products and services around that KUDO operator ecosystem. But equally, we're committed as a company to continuing to resource, a core development team who are working on KUDO. Yes, you are correct that there's a cost to every company who wants to create open source projects. But we also don't necessarily think that that it's about control of that particular project to start with, right? Because when KUDO has always been an open source project, it was conceived as an open source project, and so all the development has always been out in the open anyway. And really, we consider it beneficial to KUDO to have grow a larger user base, a larger developer base, and for other viewpoints to come in terms of how that particular piece of software gets developed. It's very easy inside an organization to form, kind of a single viewpoint about the best approach to take on the direction of a piece of software. So, more eyeballs and more users and more developer input can only be a positive thing from my perspective.
What you said in the end is really critical, because when you put an open source project in open source, you actually build an ecosystem around it. You build a community around it. This is no longer your project. And the thing is, the bigger ecosystem is around a project, the bigger customer base you will have at some point. So open source, I actually disagree whenever somebody says that I donated. No, you contributed, because donation is you give it away. You don't have to do anything with that. But when you're involved with open source, you actually contribute that project, and you're still involved there. And it's a very healthy model of commercialization as well. It's not charity. So the more business models are around there, the better it is. Now back to KUDO, since it's part of CNCF sandbox. Can you talk about how do you see the evolution? Because now CNCF, they have a very stringent process. You go sandbox, and then you move up to become a kind of graduate. Though the interesting thing is that projects like KUDO, they're already in production. Companies are already using them in production. So explain this phase. What does it mean when you put something in CNCF, but it is in sandbox stage? What does it mean for users? How is it perceived? And what should it mean? Why does it matter?
Sandbox is really a place for projects early on in the evolution of their life cycle, and it's a place that should be a space for projects to be able to experiment and to develop their particular niche. I mean, historically, there has been a very direct concept that projects would start off in sandbox and move through into incubation and then graduated, with the idea that signals, the level of maturity of that particular project, the scale of the adoption. I think that view has changed slightly, in the sense that graduation is not necessarily the end point for all projects, and that there may well be projects that stay in sandbox and become very widely used over time. But I think really it's about a kind of a slightly walled garden, in the sense that it's a space for experimentation, but still within that vendor neutral governance that the CNCF gives it.
What kind of roadmap do you see for KUDO there at CNCF?
The wider exposure of having the project in the CNCF is going to expose more use cases for technologies and perspectives. And, I think the development team very much look forward to getting those viewpoints, which may well surprise us, right? As I said before, you can come at something from a certain perspective and not really view the use cases that there might be for something until somebody else comes to you with that particular use case. I mean, one of the examples of that is, whilst we originally, the original scope of KUDO was really about managing those distributed applications, those large-scale distributed applications, we've seen more and more actual end users say, well, what we really want to manage is a whole application stack, multiple applications, multiple microservices. And that's kind of something that we didn't really anticipate in terms of the design of KUDO. I think this will evolve over time as the project is developed out in the open. I mean, from our perspective as a company, we're committed, as I said, to resourcing the core development team, and we'll continue to focus on building that ecosystem for KUDO-based operators.
You said that getting into CNCF does mean a wider visibility. But if you look at CNCF landscape, there are so many icons. You need, I think, 8K monitor to see all those icons there. And then we have also seen, because CNCF is a place where projects can very easily find their home. So we do see at times that a lot of projects, they kind of duplicate functionalities. At the same time, we also see a lot of gaps. So when it comes to operators, where do you see Kudo fits in? Where do you see an overlap where you see, hey, you know what, this is not the perfect use case for Kudo, at the same time where you see there are some gaps that we still need to fill?
I won't dig into the CNCF landscape point. I think many people have made that point before, and I think it's certainly got some truth about it. I mean, from Kudo's perspective, there are clearly some places where a tool like Kudo isn't appropriate for. If you're managing very simple applications, I see a lot of people saying, "Oh, we'll just build operators for everything." Well, that's not really what the operator pattern is about, right? If your thing has a very simple life cycle, and beyond deploying it and stopping it, it doesn't have any kind of complex things that need to happen to it while it's running, well, then that's not really the place for an operator. Generally, right, you're probably better off using a Helm chart. And I think it's important to note, certainly in my view, that there's almost no software is the silver bullet for absolutely every problem case, right? I think everything has its place, and it's good to have a wide ecosystem because things find their place about what they're good at. Kudo's very much focused on simplifying that development piece for operator developers, but it's also really focused on things inside your Kubernetes cluster and things that Kudo has created itself. So if you're building something that needs to control something outside of your cluster, or if you want to control resources that weren't created by Kudo, then that's probably not the right tool to be using for that particular job. Those things may change, right? I mean, the project's under pretty rapid development, and I think we'll see whether folks are interested in contributing that kind of code to it. But at the minute, it's got that. It's very much in that niche of simplifying the developer experience and controlling things that are within its purview.
Matt, thank you so much for taking your time out and talking about this project and why you're putting into CNCF. And I look forward to talk to you again. Thank you.
Thank you very much. It's been a pleasure.